Well, look, I am very excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Zach. And I'm honored to participate in what you will find out very quickly is this power panel of architects, developers, and builders that frankly know a lot more about this missing middle than I do. In fact, I got to say, when Zach called me up and asked if I would moderate this, I said sure, but my first question was, what exactly is it? I mean, I kind of know what it is. I think we all kind of know what it is, but it kind of made us put a definition to it. And this is where we started. We started with this definition that says the missing middle housing describes a range of multifamily or clustered housing types that are compatible in scale with single family or transitional neighborhoods. Okay, so I get that. It's got something to do with smaller scale buildings in between single family and multifamily buildings. It makes a lot of sense. It's got something to do with typology, obviously, because there are different typologies of buildings. And because of that, it's got a lot to do with zoning. And because of that, all issues come into play, such as height, density. Density is a relationship between lots of these things. Parking is a huge issue in all of these communities. Open space, setbacks, all kinds of issues related. This definition seemed to be more about the built environment, right? And with it, those are important issues to address. But it seems to me like the missing middle should be able to tackle more than the missing diversity in housing typologies present in predominantly single family neighborhoods. Like maybe it could tackle the crises that we all seem to be here for. The affordability crisis, for instance, the equity crisis that has come upon us very clearly in the past several years. And of course, the climate crisis facing communities in North America today. And so maybe an understanding of what it is, what the middle missing is less important than what is its purpose, right? So what is the missing middle trying to do? So I'm going to start us out with a working definition that I hope gets worked over through my esteemed panelists throughout the night. And that's something like this. And please excuse me, but this is my first shot at it. I want to redefine it by the end of this evening. But how about if the missing middle housing describes a range of multifamily or clustered housing typologies that return diversity, equity, affordability, and climate action currently missing in predominantly single-family zone neighborhoods. So with that start of the definition, I'd love to stop sharing and introduce the first panelist, which is Dylan Lamar. And I must say, I visited one of Dylan's projects in Portland most recently when I was out there for a conference, and I was totally blown away. And I was so pissed that he wasn't around because I wanted to hang with him and talk about his project at Tillamook. But Dylan is an owner, architect, developer at Cultivate, Inc., where he brings life, sustainable life, and affordable middle housing to Eugene, Springfield, Oregon. He's also among the leading Passivhaus consultants in the country and has supported the design of numerous Passivhaus multifamily and commercial developments nationally since 2007. So Dylan, let's get it started.
Thanks so much, Tim. That was really flattering, and I really appreciate the definition of middle housing you provided there. It's really well aligned with the definition and the purpose I've tried to bring to that. And I'll jump in here and talk a little more about that. Yeah, very, very honored to have this, to be invited to this panel. Thanks to Passivhaus Accelerator for putting it together. I'm going to talk just very briefly about some of the work I've done lately. So I was with Green Hammer as an architect up in Portland for 8 years, moved down to Eugene maybe 3-4 years ago now, and kind of transitioned from focusing solely on kind of passive house, middle housing scale work, including single family work, and moved more into the role of developer to try and kind of create more affordable, sustainable developments. And affordability in the last few years has really become front and center. You know, I published a short book called Urbanize and Insulate in 2010. And reflecting on what I was going to talk about tonight, I realized, okay, for the last, the first 15 years of my career, I really focused on the insulate portion of that title. And now, since my move to Eugene, I've really started focusing on the urbanize portion, because I realized how that really is. I think Bryn mentioned in our prep for this, it's really at the forefront of sustainability right now, at least for me. It's an important aspect. So as Tim mentioned, middle housing is kind of everything in the middle between single family detached and higher density apartment buildings. It's quite a diversity of housing types and diversity of scales. And historically, we built middle housing integrated with, there was no such thing as a single family neighborhood. It was just residential neighborhoods, and there was a diversity of housing types. I liken it to a wild ecosystem that has a diversity of species working together and serving different needs and different niches. All of that quickly got eradicated through the advent of zoning regulations, starting in kind of the teens and 20s of the 1900s. And by 1950, we had a pretty mass scale polarization of housing in this country, in pretty much every city nationwide. Low density single family on one end, high density multifamily on the other. It was a very intentional zoning regulations, very intentionally created racial segregation, economic segregation, with white owners at one end, everyone else as a renter at the other, is pretty much the typical story. Front and center in that story is the private automobile, which has had a lot of impacts on the way our cities look and feel. And also, as I mentioned, the ownership piece. And as an anecdote, I spent 10 years as a renter in Portland. I'm sad to admit, because looking back on it, I was even an architect, and I could have bought a house, but I didn't really want to. I didn't want to own a house. And then looking back, I lost about $3,300 per month over those 10 years, and missed appreciation value because the rental market, the real estate market is appreciating so wildly on the West Coast, and about $100,000 in lost equity. So in the current situation we're at with the real estate market, as hot as it is, housing has really become a commodity. And we're seeing owners reap the benefits of that, and renters really paying the price for that, and have a severe housing crisis, as I'm sure many of us are familiar with. Oregon recently, I'm very proud of my state right now. We going into effect June 31st in cities across Oregon is middle housing regulations that allow that at least the smaller end of that diversity of middle housing types. They kind of defined it with these 5 silos of housing to give people kind of a concrete feeling for it. So every lot statewide will be able to have a duplex. And then depending on the size of your lot, as it scales up to a triplex, a quadplex, a townhouse, and a cottage cluster. So they've kind of decided to kind of define these silos of housing types and made code requirements for each of them. It's a little more complex than I would like it to be, but it's a it's a huge step forward in terms of where the status quo has been for too long. As I mentioned, I was at Greenhammer in Portland for a number of years, and really we specialized in net zero middle housing, passive house housing. Ankeny Row on the left is an array of duplexes and townhouses around a courtyard and a lot that's essentially a double wide single family residential lot. No off-street parking was required. That was pretty critical to achieving that project. Tillamook Row on the right, a little bit larger, but still at the kind of townhouse apartment scale with minimal off-street parking. So as I got down to Eugene, this is a site plan of the first property I worked on. Pretty typical residential lot, a little bit narrow, a little bit deep, had an alley behind it. And as I started to pencil out what we could do here, in effect at the time, this is now about 2 years ago when I started this, was regular single family zoning with the ability to do a backyard ADU. So just in looking at the numbers, okay, I could build out of this property with a house and an ADU, and it's going to be something that I'm going to sell for about $600,000 because that's about what it'll cost to develop it. And it's going to become a rental for someone. You know, maybe you'll have an owner, a resident here, and then renting the backyard. That's a pretty common way that ADUs get integrated, and that's great. But at the end of the day, you've got a wealthy landowner and you've got someone who's stuck in rentership back here. Can we do a little better? Is there a way to divide this into 2 ownable units at $300,000, or better yet, can we make 6 units for ownership at $100,000 each? That's, the math is as simple as that when it comes to housing affordability. The more units you can get in and create ownership, the more affordable it becomes. I discovered through my nonprofit partner the world of limited equity co-ops. So I've become pretty excited about these. They've got a deep history in America. About 3/4 of all the apartment buildings in New York City are owned as cooperatives. People on the West Coast typically don't know about that. People, I'm sure, on the East Coast are more familiar with it, but co-ops have been around a long time. They were pretty much the only way to own kind of shared lot housing before the 1950s and 60s, when condos became a legal mechanism. So co-ops have a deep history. Limited equity co-ops are a specific type of co-op that creates fixed housing cost, the benefits of fixed housing costs. That's the number one benefit. You're out of the rental, open rental market. You're into a fixed housing situation. You have a relatively low upfront purchase price. Limited appreciation value is the limited equity piece. The benefit of that is that you've created a permanently affordable unit in the city. Some quick case studies. There's one in Eugene, Oregon, pictured in the bottom left here, that has been around since the 80s, and the owners living there now save about $6,000 annually over the rental market that they would be living at in otherwise. In Davis, California, Dos Pinos developed in the 70s. The residents there are saving about almost $15,000 a year. Bronx, New York, Co-op Cities is a huge limited equity co-op where you can buy a 3-bedroom house for $16,000. So the permanent affordability piece is pretty incredible. So what we developed on this property in Springfield in partnership with Square One Villages is essentially a front house and a backyard ADU. So on zoning, it's two legal dwelling units, but we carved them up into 6 private suites. And so each suite essentially has a kitchenette rather than a full kitchen. We talked openly and worked openly with the city in doing this. They recognized the crisis we were in. And so we were pretty successful with this project. The floor plan, really quickly, it's really a micro suite. It's 384 square feet, 16 by 24, about as tight as you can possibly make a 1-bedroom suite. I really want to drive home something that's become very clear to me to emphasize in these kind of talks, especially when you're talking with a general audience, is that density does not equal bulk. In my work in this world in the last few years, I've done a lot of public advocacy to help zoning reform happen more quickly so that I can do the work I want to be doing. And you get a lot of resistance over the concept of density. But typically what people are really afraid of is bulk, or they're afraid of poor people moving into their neighborhood, which they won't usually come out and say. So I like to really emphasize, the classic example is you can make a McMansion a fourplex and you have an increased balcony, but you've got 4 times the density. So these are really 2 very different concepts. As an example, with 6 suites here, we're at 48 households per acre that we developed on a single family neighborhood. That exceeds the high density zoning limit of this town. And look at it, it looks like any single family residential neighborhood kind of a development. Pretty average in size, 44% lot coverage is nowhere near the maximum allowed, 21-foot height. We could still go another 14 feet higher. It's also net zero energy ready. So in addition to affordability, I'm trying to pack in as much of the cost-effective, Passivhaus light measures as possible. For $183 a square foot, which is a pretty astoundingly low price point for this area, we did a very straightforward design, 2x8 wall construction with no exterior insulation, 14-inch I-joists in the roof, bibs in the walls. What else? Passivhaus air tightness, triple pane vinyl slider windows, kind of the cheapest high efficiency I could get. We were able to do heat pump water heaters, and then we pre-wired for mini split heat pumps. Again, prioritizing the passive efficiency measures before we go to the more active mechanical system measures. Triple bottom line sustainability, we delivered permanently affordable homeownership for a purchase price of $10,000 per owner and $770 a month monthly cost. That's a 60%. It's the affordable to households that earn 60% of area median income, which is what that AMI is about. That's the typical metric for what you call capitally affordable housing. Usually that's the threshold for rental housing, but we were able to do that with ownership. As I mentioned, the net zero energy ready. It's a 10-minute walk to downtown. A big part of my work is trying to create more walkable neighborhoods. And compared to affordable rental housing in the area, we did it for half the development costs, about $100,000 per suite, and 10% of the subsidy, $20,000 per seat. A big part of that is the small units. They're very, very small units, as I mentioned. The other part is that we have very cheap land available because we weren't having to buy multifamily land. Last slide here, I'll just emphasize that I see middle housing limit equity co-ops as a really wonderful pathway to start to provide home ownership for everybody at all rungs of that housing ladder, to really help everyone have an economically secure shelter over their head. One more thing I'll throw out there, I did recently publish a white paper for those that want to learn more about this topic, called Affordable Middle Housing Co-ops, published alongside with Eco Northwest, a planning group out of Portland. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Wow. Wow. I'm certainly going to return to those numbers. At least we need to. $10,000 purchase price, $770 a month. We can't get into this right now. Let's keep but I'm so excited. Let's keep the questions rolling. And let me introduce who's next, which is Liz from Placetailor. Liz is an architectural designer, certified Passivhaus consultant, and I just had drinks with her and their whole team at Placetailor in Boston last week. And so I've just gotten to know Liz, and I'm so excited to hear from her and her work. So anyway, she's a certified Passivhaus consultant and the energy design manager at Placetailor Elton Hampton Design. She has contributed design and energy carbon analysis for a wide variety of single family and multifamily housing projects. With a strong sense of urgency to deliver a carbon neutral built environment, she has shepherded PTEH's continued commitment to providing healthy, sustainable homes to challenged neighborhoods, and has ensured that all projects exceed the AIA 2030 Challenge carbon reduction goals since becoming a signatory in 2018. Liz received her bachelor's and master's of architecture from Wentworth Institute of Technology, and is currently pursuing a master's in natural resource stewardship and ecological restoration at Colorado State University, focusing on carbon reduction and sequestration in architecture and landscape restoration. Liz, didn't you finish that degree?
No, still working on it.
Oh, I thought we were
One
celebrating.
more year to go.
Okay, sorry. Anyway, Liz, take it away.
All right, Tim, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm happy to be here and share my experiences with you all. All right, I trust that everybody can see my screen.
Looks good.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm happy to be here and give you this breakdown of the missing middle typology from Placetailor Elton Hampton's perspective, which I may refer to as future housing throughout the presentation. And so to give a brief precursor to my content, we are a Boston-based firm, and the zoning regulations here favor the missing middle typology, as we see it essential for providing more housing options. So our zoning code has what is called smart growth overlay districts. These districts encourage a diversity of housing opportunities to increase the availability of affordable units at a range of housing choices for households of all incomes, ages, sizes. And this is in order to meet the current and anticipated housing needs, because we are in an extreme shortage. So these districts also encourage compact design, mixed uses, and encourage community and developer collaboration. Boston and some of the surrounding towns also offer developer incentives, which allow the owner to build more units if the building achieves LEED or Passivhaus level design. So Boston is a very forward-thinking city, which I'm fortunate to design in. So with some of the zoning landscape covered, I'm going to give a brief overview of the following items, as they're all essential to explaining how we've been successful at providing future housing here in Massachusetts. We are a mission-driven company first, and the business model came second to that. This allowed us the opportunity to chart our own path and ensure we get to deliver the types of projects our client, community, and planet so desperately needs today. I'll then review a multifamily project we completed in the last few years to offer some insight. We believe in mission first, period. And our company mission is a direct response to the current state of our landscape, both socioeconomically and environmentally. Our team is comprised of accomplished professionals who understand the urgency in which we must address our industry's shortcomings. It is up to us collectively to steer our course to a sustainable future. And with that in mind, Placetailor was founded in 2008 on the premise that there are no longer technical or financial hurdles to building sustainable housing. So the folks that got Placetailor off the ground were committed to structuring the company around the triple bottom line of environment, social equity, and economic viability. That laser-focused mission of carbon and community in a for-profit housing company drove everything. The business model evolved in order to meet the mission rather than the mission being diluted by the use of an outdated model. And when the founders hit a technical or financial roadblock in a project, they took on that scope to find a resolution that did not compromise any of our driving factors. And so after getting their feet under them on a handful of single and multi-family projects, they built a company that better reflects the movement that we so desperately needed in our city. And why is this so important to us? Well, the struggles facing our city are not unique to us, as I'm sure many others are also trying to address these same concerns, which are the climate, housing, community, gentrification, and health crises. And to address just one or some of these concerns is to allow the others to worsen. The premise of future housing is to ensure that we are addressing all four facets of the issues we're facing with housing today, and this is the crux of our mission and what we strive to improve on. So what is Placetailor? We're a Boston-based vertically integrated design, development, and construction cooperative focused exclusively on future housing, which we are defining as zero carbon, community positive, hyper-sustainable housing with an innovative delivery process. The benefit of being able to develop some of our own projects independently or as partners with outside clients has allowed us to use our projects as practice-based R&D endeavors. It is critical for the advancement of our firm to be able to learn from the performance of our previous projects and build upon that knowledge for our future clients. Otherwise, if we aren't continually improving, then we are simply selling our past mistakes to our future clients. The benefit to an R&D approach allows us to try the best and current advancements in building science to improve upon our last build. This also creates an exciting work environment, one in which I'm lucky to be a part of. So now I'll get into how we structured our business model to achieve our mission. Placetailor Cooperative is set up with an integrated model that is broken down into 4 different entities. Each division can operate independently from one another to provide their services to outside clients, but we all share the benefit of internal management and other resources. But because we all live under the same roof, we can come together to deliver a fully integrated project, and this is typically where the magic happens. It is this integration that has allowed us to create future housing because we can control the input and output of design. It can't be overstated that our ability to draw a line in the sand and say we will not do work that is at least Passivhaus standard is due to this cooperative team building approach and the integrated model. Now, this cooperative approach allows us to attract the talent that has no interest in unnecessary compromise, and the integrated model allows us to prioritize our finances in order to achieve our goals on projects. Because of these, we've been able to achieve a number of firsts related to Passivhaus, net zero energy, zero carbon, and prefab approaches. And so it's not just a company, it's a movement, and we're going to drive that movement forward cooperatively with anyone who shares that mission. And meet the team of leadership who share that mission at Placetailor. Now, Placetailor Design Studio has since merged with longtime affordable housing experts Elton Hampton Architects, and PTEH Design serves both the Placetailor development and build, as well as a variety of housing development and private clients at all scales. What is consistent across all design projects, both for internal or external clients, is 1, early and regular energy modeling and design input from Passivhaus experts, and 2, the inclusion of integrated input from our development and construction divisions throughout design. So baking in a collaborative, integrated perspectives is critical. There needs to be some common experience and understanding both upstream and downstream in a project's development. To achieve our triple bottom line goals, everyone both up and down the stream must be well informed about what other divisions are proposing so that we can collectively pull the right levers across the entire process to achieve them. So, for example, upstream, when a project is just starting out, there are many assumptions that get baked into a development pro forma, some in which are difficult to adjust once things get rolling. So it's important to make sure everyone is on the same page at the start of a project and along each critical moment within the project to make sure we are able to hit our key goals. So having an integrated business model really fosters this collaborative process and makes sure we're setting each project up for optimized success. Now I'll get into one of the case studies we've completed. This is 246 Norwell, and it touched upon 3 of our 4 divisions, the PT Design, PT Builds, and PT Techs, and we were able to do some R&D in various high-performance systems and assemblies. Now, this was completed back in 2018. So I'll walk you through the project's developmental process and then get into some cost breakdowns near the end. So upstream, when this project first started out, it's very important to align clients' goals with the company's mission. And some of the requirements that we were approached with by the client is to provide 6 units of workforce housing. And his target was $200 per square foot of building cost. And Placetailor was still feeling out Passivhaus at this point when the project first started. And so we had asked, if we could pursue Passivhaus standard and maybe develop some different technology that we were working on, and the client was willing to. And so that's very helpful. Now, as I said, the program was 6 units, so workforce housing. It was a mix of 3 and 2 bedroom units. And it's 1 parking space per unit. The lot area was rather small, around 7,000 square feet. And with the zoning setback requirements, it left us with a maximum building footprint of around 55 to 50 feet. And so our concept is rather simple because it was informed by the zoning setbacks. A simple square, but this makes it very easy to detail and there's less failure points. This cube gives you a really efficient surface to volume ratio as well as a heat loss form factor. So this made it very easy to meet our Passivhaus requirements. We also utilized efficient layouts, so compact unit size, and we focus on minimizing circulation within the building. And we utilized shared plumbing walls for efficiency. What was also clever about this design was we built to a 4x8 grid. This reduced material waste and reduced cost for materials. And the 4x8 is based on your standard plywood sheathing, and so the windows were spaced according to that. And all along this process, we were doing energy modeling from the start, middle, and end. And these are a breakdown of what some of those stats looks like that we needed to target. The predicted energy use intensity was 16.9 kBTUs per square foot per year. This is roughly a 70% energy reduction from code design. And we utilized a double stud exterior wall system. The second outermost stud was a panel that we were able to bring on site and crane it into place. So this accelerated construction. And we utilized R50 for walls, R60 in the roofs, R20 for insulation under slab. Again, this was airtight construction built to Passivhaus level. We did ERVs with an 80%, 85 recovery or better, high performance windows, triple glazed, and high performance exterior doors. This is a photo of the construction process. You can see these are the double stud walls with the WRB outside of that. And again, this was panelized construction, so it allowed for it to go up rather quickly. And this is a cost breakdown per assembly type. And so the total overall cost increase to construction was $56,000, and the total building cost was $1.1 million. So this breaks down to roughly $191 per square foot, which was under the client's requirement. So we were great. And this is how it breaks down per assembly type. You can see the majority of that cost was in the exterior wall framing because we did the double stud wall assembly. Second to that is the insulation that filled that cavity. But again, this is just from the $56,000 additional cost. Here is the payback period that we estimated for the client based on the energy use intensity from a Passivhaus building to a code minimum. So by going to Passivhaus, you would save on annually around $6,500. And so the simple payback period from 56,000 is 8.5 years. The overall return on investment is 100% in 30 years. And so the client did receive additional funding from Mass Housing's Workforce Housing Initiative. And again, we had to target individuals and families with incomes of 61 to 120% of the area median income. And this incentive provided $100,000 per unit of workforce housing. So we, at the end of the project, we created 6 rent restricted units. And these are some of our main take rates. So in an integrated analysis and project delivery, both mission and model was essential in helping us deliver this efficiently and within budget. We utilize straightforward assemblies and design. So simplicity of form is essential for reducing costs. And that is all for me. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. That was exciting. And I just, again, so just quickly, the people that are occupying it, 61 to 120% AMI,
That's correct.
correct? And are they on the lower end of that or the higher end of that?
On the lower end was the final.
That's so exciting. Well, thank you. So now I would like to introduce Bryn Davidson, who is a co-founder of Lanefab, an integrated design build team, crafts custom high-performance homes in Vancouver, BC, and beyond that region as well. The firm's design build approach blends the design ethos of mid-century Scandinavian and Japanese modernism with the environmental ethos of walkable urban infill and Passivhaus construction. The firm has completed over 100 lane houses along with a range of full-size custom homes, duplexes, character homes. I wonder what that is. Character homes. Can't wait to hear about that. And certified passive houses, including the first certified passive houses in New Westminster, BC, and Burnaby, BC. And Bryn, I have a connection with everybody on this panel, including you, because you apparently grew up very close to our friend and colleague in our climate action work. And now I just lost his name. You told me, remember?
In near Folsom or near
Folsom Prison.
Yeah.
Anyway, take it away. That was a dumb joke.
Thanks. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to pop this up here. Okay. So I'm Bryn Davidson. I'm co-owner of Lanefab along with my business partner builder Matt Turner. We've been doing this since 2009. So for the last 13 years or so, we've been doing urban infill and wrestling with aspects of green building, and just sort of doing it, all the way through from design through construction. So I'll show you some of the stuff that we've been doing in terms of urban infill, but then I'm going to just sort of skip to what we're currently thinking about in terms of ideas for the future, especially of Vancouver, but for single family neighborhoods in general going forward. And it's just sort of more conceptual stuff at this point, because we've got a great sort of think tank here. We can talk about it. So Vancouver is very much like most other North American cities, where we've got these vast, and this is the yellow, these vast swaths of so-called single family zones. And then these little corridors where they allow the multifamily housing. Basically everywhere that it's polluted and noisy is where they allow you to put multifamily housing. The quiet areas are reserved for single family. But back in 2009, Vancouver was the first North American city to allow laneway houses or alley houses, ADUs, pretty much throughout the entire city. They had allowed basement suites before. So as of 2009, you could actually have 3 dwellings on every single family property throughout the city. So at that time, when we formed the company, we branded around this idea of laneway houses. And jumped in, and we were able to build the first laneway house in the city of Vancouver. This is us with the client mixing some concrete by hand, because that's what you do when you're starting a new company with no capital. It was a good experience and lots of interest in this first laneway house, and it kind of grew from there. And now Vancouver does 500 or 600 laneway houses per year and has for the last decade. These are some of the other laneway houses that we've been doing. They're typically 700 to 1,000 square feet. Most of the ones that we are doing are for extended families. So they're one of the only forms of development where you can build something new without paying anything for land. That works if you've got your parents that already own the land, if you're lucky enough. So we've done a whole bunch of different laneway houses. Some of them are solar, like this one. They're all built with thick insulated walls and triple glazed windows. We decided early on that we were going to do that on every single one of our projects, whether the clients wanted it or not, because we said this is how we're going to do it. And we've managed to do that for over a decade. We started incorporating Passivhaus components into our projects, rainwater capture, all these different interesting things. And it's this sort of rolling R&D process, design, build, design, build. We expanded that into going back to doing full-size homes and laneway houses together. So on these types of projects, there would be 2 or maybe 3 properties on a concurrent or on the same lot. Then a few years ago, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, I don't know, we started learning about Passivhaus. And up until that point, we'd been making up our own kind of secret sauce of thick walls and HRVs and whatever. But really, we were kind of making shit up. There wasn't necessarily a lot of rigor to it. But when we discovered Passivhaus, we were like, oh my gosh, here's this sort of very German sort of structural system that brings together everything we were already doing and takes it that little bit further. And so at the same time, the city of Vancouver was bringing in some interesting incentives for certified Passivhaus projects. And so it all started to come together where we made the shift towards doing Passivhaus or similar for all of our projects that come in through the door, the full-size homes. So this was our first PHI in Darmstadt certified Passivhaus that we did in Vancouver, a single family house with a basement suite. This was the first certified Passivhaus in New Westminster. This is one we recently did in Burnaby, BC, again, a single family house. This one was fun because we were able to take apart the old house that was on site and resaw the structural lumber into cladding that we used on the new Passivhaus. So we get to lower our embodied carbon a little bit there and carry some memory of that. And we were also doing certified Passivhauses in combination with laneway houses. And our goal, and this was something that I kind of covered I did a TEDx talk in 2014 about climate and buildings. The goal was to kind of look at how much of a climate impact from the old house there was before, and to try and create 3 new dwellings on site that had less of a climate impact than what you had before. So you had a net positive impact in terms of your development reducing emissions. And that's been kind of the ethos of where we've been trying to go with our projects through all of this. This is 2 side-by-side properties, both with a house, basement suite, and laneway house. So redeveloping into 6 lots, 2 of them in a certified Passivhaus buildings, and 2 in these sort of energy efficient laneway houses in the back. And this has basically been about as far as we could go because that's what the zoning allowed. We always want to push further, but we've realized, like everyone else on this screen, that the green building, the Passivhaus, the embodied carbon stuff, that only gets you part way, and then the rest of the way is in your zoning. Like the zoning is the future of green building, and that's why this kind of advocacy work that everybody's talking about right now is so important. Because what we need to do is to be able to bring more people into these neighborhoods that are low density, these existing neighborhoods with amenities, with schools, with transit, all of these things. This is a project that we worked on as a Passivhaus consultant. It's a Passivhaus 12-plex co-housing light. This is exactly the kind of thing we needed throughout the entire city, but the way Vancouver is structured, this thing had to go through a rezoning, and it spent like 3 years going through a rezoning and development permit and public hearings and all this other BS. So, when I look at how easy it is to permit a mansion versus how easy it is to get a permit for something that's actually useful, I always say that there's this big discrepancy in the way our cities are structured. And I always ask planners to use the mansion test in terms of whether their permitting process is actually equivalent to what we're giving away to people who want a big giant house. So anyway, that's where we've been. Now, going forward, the question is, how do we, go from here to there? We've had laneway houses for a decade. We're now doing duplexes with suites, which kind of gives us sort of a fourplex, but we need to start to go further. And we've been having this conversation with folks on Twitter, with city planners, and now with you guys. In Vancouver, we have a lot of existing missing middle typologies, but just clustered in those little blue zones. So we've got, what I call the house and laneway house on steroids, split into two buildings, but apartment density. We've got stacked townhouses. We've got apartment buildings with underground parkades. We've got all this kind of stuff. But as we started, in our office, we started drawing these things and trying to come up with a kind of typology study where we looked at all these different things, trying to think about where Vancouver should be going in the future. And these are all sort of equivalent density, 1.4 FAR, sort of apartment density, but on a single individual lot. So they could be developed without having to consolidate a whole bunch of lots at today's prices. So what came up was just this sort of collection of ideas that what we have been doing is all this stuff that harkens back to 1922 when zoning was first brought in and was really about reinforcing single family character. And all of our subsequent typologies, a lot of them have really tried to work with that. We've been more in favor of lower height and more site coverage, character, those character homes, which we call, those kind of pre-1940 character homes. This idea of hidden density, front yards, side yards, all of this kind of stuff is about trying to cling to this idea of this single family character. And I get why that happens politically. But now we're in 2022 and we're wrestling with a bunch of these new issues that they didn't have in 1922, or maybe they didn't think about. So we're thinking both about operational and embodied carbon. We're thinking about transport carbon. Are we walkable? What's the impact of our parking? Do we have some good support for e-bikes and electric cars, those kind of things? If we're scaling up these kind of housing projects across the city, do we need to keep a higher level of permeability so that we don't overwhelm the existing storm sewer systems, which is a real crux issue in Vancouver? And then the last one is accessibility, because so many of our houseplex typologies are frankly fundamentally inaccessible. And the question I've seen posed by accessibility advocates is whether, if we're going to invent something entirely new that is the future of the fabric of our city, should it not be accessible? And after banging my head against that one for years, I've kind of come around to the idea that, yeah, I think that probably is where we should be going. So now then I started, chatting with a fellow named Mike Eliason in Seattle, and looking more at these kind of European typologies. And when I say Europe, I don't want to be overly Eurocentric, because these are all around the world. In Vietnam, all sorts of interesting places. We just saw one from Placetailor. This idea of orienting your multifamily housing around these kind of single stair cores, which allows for a smaller footprint, more daylight, cross ventilation, all of these really interesting things, but is totally different than the way we typically do stuff in North America with double loaded corridors and really large site coverage and really high FAR. And so when we look at the European examples, they're only about 50% site coverage, lots of green space, connected buildings with no side yard. They're taller than what we typically see in North America in the single family zone, so 3 to 8 stories. And they have pretty small frontage, so they're not, like in Vancouver, when you do apartment buildings, often they'll redevelop the whole block. But I'm quite interested in this sort of fine-grained urbanism where we can replace lot by lot. I love this example just because it shows that, a bit of height trading off that extra green space in the back. Big balconies, shared spaces, very different than the kind of North American single family sort of ideal, but also I think this unlocks so much that it's worth exploring. So when we started sketching out these ideas for Vancouver, we started putting together what we've come to call a fabplex. We've done hundreds of different prototypes over the years, and we always share them. This is one of the few that seemed to garner a lot of interest from all sides of the political spectrum, which was actually interesting to me because there was folks who fought a lot of housing that said, oh, well, maybe we could support this. Notably, they freaked out a bit at the 4-story version, but the 3-story version didn't seem to freak them out as much. So I think maybe this is our next toehold into the neighborhood in the way that laneway houses were a decade ago. Again, this idea of having fairly low site coverage, degree of rear yard compatibility, keeping the permeability, limited at-grade parking so that you're not putting this massive underground carbon iceberg, this carbon bomb of an underground parkade, and e-bike parking, all of these kind of things, and trying to create family-sized units in the kind of 900 to 1,500 square foot range, 3 bedrooms, something that you could live in with a family permanently, without just having to squeeze into a micro suite. Having them be accessible. In Vancouver, we have to have a second egress stair. So we're in Vancouver, we have these 33-foot lots and 50-foot lots. Those are a typical urban fabric. We can work on both. And the goal here was to basically do a European building for some of it, push right to the property line, but where you stick into the front yard or the backyard to actually retain a little bit of a side yard setback. So I see this as kind of a compromise between the North American approach with setbacks to something that maybe allows us to have a more European or global approach in terms of a housing typology. And the benefit of this is once you have this basic fabric in place, you can go from 3 stories up to 8 stories within basically the same design, the same footprint, everything else, and you can align them up together and you get all the energy efficiency benefits. I'm realizing that this is basically just a more expensive version of what Placetailor is already doing. So I think it's amazing to see that those same ideas being employed in a very different zoning jurisdiction. And so this is kind of where I'm trying to push the city planners. I'm curious to get people's feedback because it is different. I really see that there's a push to do townhouses, a push to do houseplexes, all of these things that kind of look like a single family house. But I kind of feel like at a certain point, at least in Vancouver, we've got to sort of rip off that Band-Aid and realize that we are a city actually and not a suburb, and figure out what is the kind of housing that we can sort of, it's like a density sponge or something, a kind of framework that we can build the future city upon. So this is hopefully in a couple of years what we will be doing. So I am going to just leave it there and looking forward to chatting with you guys. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Bryn. That was fantastic. And I'm just going to remember zoning is the future of green building. So let's go to our last panelist, Julie Klump. I'm proud to introduce. She is the Vice President for Design and Building Performance of Preservation of Affordable Housing, or POA, responsible for design and energy efficiency for development projects and the own portfolio. Julie authors POA's product and performance specification used by development and maintenance staff when selecting building materials and components. Additionally, she manages the data collection and analysis that define the efficiency efforts and serves as a subject matter expert for all aspects of building performance. And I am so excited to be able to begin to work with Julie on one of her projects in Salem, Massachusetts, because I have a lot to learn from her. Take it away, Julie.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it, Tim, and I appreciate the invitation. This image is, maybe it's a little dramatic, but I think it tells a lot, and it tells a lot about the story of the families that we are redeveloping a project in DC for. Question mark on the missing middle was because I wasn't exactly sure if POA was doing enough around the missing middle. And this site has a very rich history, and there are some interesting things that we are doing, which I'll get into at the end. But this photograph isn't, it's not an old photo. So POA is in 11 states and DC. We have close to 12. Are you guys seeing the slide?
Yep, looks good.
Okay.
Thanks, Julie.
Sorry, I have two screens and one of them's different. So we have 12,000 units. At the moment, we have 2,500, over 2,500 in construction or in rehab. So it's a lot to keep up with. The different climate zones kind of make it challenging in terms of energy efficiency and zoning. But the sorry. So POA has a strategic plan. We're on our second 5-year plan, and we've come a long way. I've worked at POA for 12 years plus, and we started counting carbon. We've started, we have a few passive house projects. This is 5 of 10. One of them is a rehab. And we finally convinced enough of the real estate developers that it was okay for us to put in our strategic plan that by 2025, we want all of our new construction and hopefully our rehab to be passive house. So we're pretty psyched about that. Some of these projects were not designed initially to be passive house, but we were able to convert them. The top 3, the top left is in DC that I'm going to talk about a little bit. The top 2 on the other, in the middle and the right, are in Boston. Bottom right is the rehab project in Salem, Mass, and bottom left is a project in Chicago. So I just thought this was kind of interesting. This is the site. It's called Berry Farm. It was owned by a man by the name of Berry, who owned slaves, but ultimately sold the land to the Freedmen's Group, who ultimately sold 1-acre properties to recently freed slaves after the Civil War. And this map is from 1608, and you can see that there's a longhouse zoomed in there. So maybe that was the first house on our site. This is this shows the type of house that was built. Everybody was sold an acre of land and the materials to build a 1-room house. They didn't initially come with utilities other than, I think, electricity. But the people in the community really fought hard and were able to get sanitary and other utilities brought into the site. And I think it's unfortunate. I did some research trying to find more examples of what was there, because I just thought it was so amazing that the people that moved in there was their first chance to own land, and they were all eager to build their own homes. Then most of those houses were demolished and taken over for the production of what they refer to as Berry dwellings. I grew up in military housing, so this looks very familiar to me. Wasn't exactly a military base housing, but it was housing for people coming home from World War II that needed a place to live. So it was owned and managed by what's now the DC Housing Authority. So fast forward, this is how it looked when we bought it. And this is a co-development partnership with the DC Housing Authority. It had changed a lot. It was obviously the wood frame was demolished, and then it was block, and then it was ultimately stuccoed. And you can sort of see the final condition here before it was determined that the site really should be redeveloped. So that's, it was 450 units. Now we are, our current plan shows building 900 units. Phase 1 includes the building that I showed earlier, which is 100 units of senior housing, and a building of family building that kind of abut a recreation center. So that, and then there's some other multifamily buildings that kind of run along a major street. But there's 115 townhomes that'll be built as part of this. And the goal is to get as many homes created so that the people that had to move out can come back. We're committed to doing all Passivhaus for all the buildings here. We're looking at microgrids. We're even doing a training session with some high school students on building a net zero construction trailer that we can reproduce and use around the site. We hope to use a panelized building product here, Blueprint Robotics. What we're running into there is that another priority of ours is workforce development, and there's still some concern that if we panelize everything and bring it to the site, we might limit that workforce development to some degree. But we know that there's lots of work to do on site. So these are the first two buildings. The building, we're working with a great CPHC, Michael Hindle. He's determined that Passivhaus isn't going to cost more. In my role at POA, I love a delay. So we had a lot of zoning delays at Berry Farm. People were interested in keeping the historic buildings. The current zoning didn't allow for this amount of density. So we started this project in 2014, and we're just getting the building permit for the building on the right. And we don't have continuous insulation on this building. Michael's figured out some really amazing details and modeled it very carefully. I'm not sure going forward if we're going to go that route, but I thought it was great that we inherited a building or designed a building that wasn't going to be Passivhaus, and then we didn't have to modify it that much to get it to Passivhaus. So this is a diagram of the townhomes, and you can see, the M means market rate, the A is affordable, the R is rental, and LW is live work. And what I'm so excited about this is that some of these are going to be for sale. Some of them are live work. We're planning on doing solar storage at all we can afford to do here. It's new for POA. We've never done live work. We've never done home ownership, and we haven't done townhomes at this density. Typically, we're doing multifamily buildings that are, 4 or 5 stories that are 50 to 100 buildings. So I think this whole townhome community, I'm hoping that it pays off. This is a slide that shows, over to the right, you can see a more square floor plan. That was what the 4-bedroom units look like. So we are sort of creating a different typology than what was there. This is a 3-story walk up. And we have units, I think more in the multifamily, but we have 4 and 5 unit townhomes, and we also have some 6 unit in the multifamily. So this is a presentation that we did for the community. We have excellent community engagement, and we're maintaining a lot of connection with the people that moved out. And we want to sort of things like, this is what your unit looked like, this is what it's going to look like, just to get people comfortable and excited about that. So this is the an original building, and on the right is some sort of precedents for a rendering for how the townhomes might look. Maybe taking something from the vernacular of this. I don't think the designs are there yet, but I wanted to show them. These buildings will be 50 to 60% AMI. I think the most is 60% AMI. Because we haven't done homeownership, I'm not sure exactly how that model works. but I'm glad that Poe is kind of taking this on, and um, maybe in some cases it's good that history doesn't repeat itself, but maybe looking back is helping us figure out what really needs to be here, which is some home ownership townhomes.
Wow, thank you. We have another 2 or 3 hours to discuss this, don't we, Zach?
I think we need it.
Oh my God, there's just so much here.
It's so true.
Are a lot of questions here, and I think it behooves us to just jump into what people have been wondering. I've got my own questions, but why don't we just start with the first one that came in about. There's just a question from Enrique Bueno about the ventilation system in Dylan's project that you presented. I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but are you asking what the manufacturer is?
No. He showed a list of items there, but I didn't see any ventilation in the list. So that's why I was wondering what if he was considering ventilation and what kind of ventilation he was considering.
Yeah, that's it. We weren't able to afford heat recovery ventilation, unfortunately. So it's just direct exhaust fans from the bathrooms and kitchens. It's interesting though, even though they're suites and not able to be permitted as full kitchens, they did allow us to put in true exhausting range hoods in all of the kitchenettes. They have, since our project is completed, changed the local building code regulations to prohibit a range hood from anything that's not a kitchen. So they're actually decreasing the life safety. Even though we can still build a kitchenette, we now just can't provide it with a range hood. So it's an unfortunate situation. These are the kind of things you run into when you're trying to kind of find these workarounds to create affordability.
And how do you make for the makeup air?
Yeah, it's, as I mentioned, we kind of intentionally chose vinyl slider windows. So we can trust that they're going to leak enough to bring in the makeup air, which will kind of be nice in terms of making sure it comes in through the bedrooms. It's a compromise, and that's the kind of world you enter when you're in this kind of deep affordability world.
Yeah, that requires a special climate zone too.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
And so just to follow up with that, Dylan, just curious then, you did a blower door test on the project?
We did, yeah. Aero Barrier did the aerosol air tightness from the interior during framing. We exceeded 1.0 ACH 650, and I want to do another test, like, a year, 2 years after all the lumber's dried out. My concern is as that lumber dries out more, you're going to get more gaps opening up, but we haven't done one yet.
Yeah. Okay. Well, still,
with slider windows, one ACH 50, I was pretty pleased.
Yeah. I mean, and so again, the translation from, what does it mean to what are the utility costs? Do you have any sense of that? I don't remember if I saw that number.
It's included in that $770 per month total, and that includes all costs to the owners, utilities and everything, maintenance reserves, putting away money for the future roof replacement, everything's included there. Yeah.
Now, because I'm so fascinated, I don't quite understand how you made this possible, how you could possibly make this work, but the $10,000 purchase price?
Yeah. So the construction funding is 100% private social investors, basically me and 4 other guys that live locally and wanted to do something good in the neighborhood. The permanent financing is a 65% loan to value loan from a local bank that's going to hold a portfolio loan. That's the blanket loan to the cooperative. So the cooperative itself holds that mortgage. Then there's subsidy that fills a large section of that, but still less than I think came out to about $26,000 per unit was the total subsidy amount. Most affordable housing has $250,000 of subsidy per unit, or can have up to that. And then we had a kind of gap financing from the social investors, a 10-year loan at around 6% interest to help, I forget now, it's been a while, but basically a 10-year loan. And that really is to fill the gap between what housing will appraise for versus what it costs. I'm sure many are familiar with this, that in the residential, especially small residential world, the projects just don't appraise well. The appraisals kind of lag behind where the construction cost market is. And so you end up in these situations where even though our appraisal came in what we estimated, we still just kind of needed that gap funding to happen. We're working to avoid that now. It's a complex financial situation to be in, but at the end of the day, $770 a month for a one-bedroom ownership position is pretty rare.
Yeah, and I think the thing that really hasn't been stated here is that, and I want to hear from Bryn about this too, but Julie talked very specifically about this range of affordability, market rate, various typologies of building, various sizes. So there's this diversity, not just of building types, but of kind of economic stratum for the community, right? I think Bryn, your projects are more in the market rate world, but trying to bring some affordability through the laneway housing. But you and Liz are trying to do this workforce housing, which we typically call between affordable and i.e. subsidized and market rate. You're trying to do this with very few subsidies. And so the funding structure that you just talked about is really unique. And so I wonder whether that funding structure for that very unique financing strategy is replicable, right? Like, will developers be interested in building this kind of workforce housing? Are the returns, even with this social equity, these social equity partners, do the returns make sense for other developers to take this on? That's to you, Dylan.
Oh, sorry, for me. I thought you were speaking toward Bryn. Yeah, what I would want to mention is that, again, we use such little subsidy that without any subsidy, we would still hit the workforce affordability range which is typically defined between 80% and 120% of area median income. So, and that's actually my goal. I'm a for-profit business. I make a fee on all my projects to stay in business. And that's my goal, is to really be doing 3 or 4 unsubsidized workforce affordable housing, in addition to some partnerships with nonprofits to create more affordable housing. But, again, I frequently go back to the analogy of an ecosystem. Our built environment needs to reflect the diversity of the natural ecosystem. It needs to have both the diversity of typologies of housing and also a diversity of economic strata to be housed in those typologies. A quick point I'll add about the suites as the kind of the micro suites as a strategy. I do think it's a strategy that's particularly well suited to me as a small fry trying to do, 3 or 4 small projects a year, because our capitally affordable housing world really incentivizes 3-bedroom plus units. Right. Our market rate housing world really incentivizes 3-bedroom plus units, just because you can get more money for that. So we really, and yet in Oregon, our average household size is below 2.5 people per household and shrinking. And yet our housing square footage per housing unit is going up. You look at those curves and they're trend curves and they're just opposite. We have, I can count on one hand the number of 1-bedroom ownership units that have sold in the last year in this town.
Yeah. And
it's ridiculous because there's tens of thousands of people that could benefit, that are on fixed income. If they're, retired on fixed income, they're up and coming, young folks that need a starter home. we need some micro ownership units to help fill that spectrum of housing. So I kind of went on a tangent there. Did that
No,
get to your
no,
question?
no.
Okay.
No, it's okay. Well, look, let's jump to some other questions just because I think we'll come back to this question of financing and affordability for these kinds of projects, because it's a unique, what you guys are doing is very unique. You're trying to build a affordable housing without the real subsidies that are in LIHTC deals, for instance, and that's just really challenging to do. Okay, so Daniel Clark, yeah, you were asking about the one stair for that. I think it was a sixplex in Liz's presentation. So he was just wondering, do you want to maybe open the question up, or do you want to just ask Liz? Should we just ask Liz why the one stair?
No, that was basically it. I mean, I have to check our local codes, but the single point of egress for that many units just seemed odd. But if it's pretty common for that area at least, then I wasn't missing anything.
Yep, no, it's common for Boston. So the building is below 3 stories tall, and the 2 bottom units have their own direct access egress as well.
Yeah, that's my understanding of the code too, is that if you have more than 4 units, is that correct, Liz?
I believe so.
Accessing an exit, then you need a second stair. But 4 and under, you need 1. Which maybe connects to Bryn's Euro block interest, which I find really fascinating. Of course, I think that what that's going to require, Bryn, are building code changes, not so much energy code changes, right?
Yeah, it's a building code change, and actually Mike is on the call here, I think. But this is something just in the last year or two I've been looking at as the ability to really unlock a lot of interesting urbanism is changing these egress requirements, because in most of Europe you can go 3, 6, 8, even maybe 12 or more stories on a single stair core. I think in Seattle you can go to 6 floors currently, whereas Vancouver we can't at all. And when you do that, you get rid of this double loaded corridor, which really makes for a lot of crappy buildings. No offense to people who have to do that. And so I think there's no evidence that there's any decrease in life safety outcomes. So I think it's something that is being proposed as a change to the Canadian Building Code. And I'm hoping that in Vancouver, where we have our own building code, that we can also see something maybe up to 6 stories. Because I do think it is worth trying to unlock what that can allow.
And it's fascinating because in writing, and I need everybody's help in kind of reshaping that definition of the missing middle housing that we're talking about here. But one of the things I was going to put in was that, typically 4 stories and below is what typically middle housing is defined as. But you're saying, well, what if it's not about the number of stories? What if it's about the number of exits? What if it's about reducing the circulation such that there are much more efficient, many more efficient units on a very small lot, which I find a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, we push this idea of single lot development,
right.
This hashtag no assembly required, just because what we found with laneway houses is they're expensive buildings to build, but there's no land cost. So as an existing owner, you can build them. So if you're an owner who can develop at 1970s land costs, it's very different than a developer assembling a bunch of lots in 2022. Like our typical single family lot in Vancouver is $1 million to $2 million. Like a 50-foot lot is close to $4 million. Like the economics are just like, it's crazy. But I think that there is so much that we can do, and if we have a typology that works on a fine-grained increment, then we can sprinkle them throughout the whole city, as opposed to just sort of redoing one area entirely.
Yeah, it's really, really fascinating. Okay, Daniel Clark, you had a question for Liz. Do you want to ask it again? Oh wait, no, you just did. I just went to you. Jim Kuman, question for Liz?
Yeah, I just was curious on the HVAC side. I didn't see a lot of details there, so I was just curious to know what you put in the building.
Sure. So it was a Zender's, I believe it was a 200Q, and it's one per unit with the outdoor condensers. And so the condensers were located on the roof.
And how about heating and cooling?
Those were the Mitsubishi heat pump units, also one per unit.
Got it.
Do you guys need the high heat there in Boston?
So we typically supplement the heating and cooling with baseboard electric heaters for the winter because typically the Mitsubishi units can't accommodate the full heating load unless you size up the system more, but then you're over the cooling demands for the summer. So it's an overly large system. So we find it useful to just split that heating load between the heat pump and the baseboard heaters.
Oh, and that can work in the energy model, whether it's PHPP or WFE passive.
Yeah, that it actually works pretty well because we get to do a smaller sized heat pump system, and they're pretty minimal, the baseboard heaters we put in.
Right. Just takes the edge off.
Yeah, right.
So those are the smallest units you can basically buy, 7,000, 9,000 BTU units. Basically, so that's probably we can't buy anything less than that. So you kind of have to bottom out the units at that point. So that's the problem I've been seeing is once you get into 500 square foot or less, one bedroom type units, you just can't make the units, the HVAC any smaller because they don't make them any smaller.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan Schumacher, you say that was this is for Liz too, that was 2018 costs and subsidy. What's the forecast for 2023?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
So I think what he meant was that project was done in 2018. So the costs and subsidy were associated with 2018 pricing. What is that, doubled now in 2023?
No, that's a very good question. I appreciate it. I haven't done out the numbers to figure out what it'd be in today's dollar, but it was a different landscape back then. So those numbers are a little outdated for today's conversation.
All right. Couple more for Liz. Jelena Garrick, why don't you just ask the question?
Sure, thanks. So Liz, I was just wondering, for the analysis that was done in WFE, do you have any actual data for energy consumption at the moment? I'm not sure how long ago this was constructed and how it's metered and that type of thing, but is there any sort of information that you have for that?
So these are metered individually per unit. Unfortunately, we do not have that information, but we have talked about it internally because we work with this developer quite frequently on other projects. And so this has been a conversation with him in the past if we could get access to this information. Because as I stated earlier, it's really helpful if you can look back at how your building performed, so then you're not selling your past mistakes to your future clients. And this backwards research is critical. And so we are pushing to get that information, but we don't have it at the moment.
That's that's something that we noticed as well, in terms of, what gets modeled in WFE or elsewhere, and then, what actually happens. And it varies between, types of buildings and whatnot. So yeah, no, that's fair. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me throw one at Julie. Ask him, Senyurt, you had a question, but how will you achieve insulation levels for pH? I mean, are you that far along with the project, Julie? I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know in the end. We had the time to really develop the details, but I don't know in the end if we are going to go that route. There's a rabbet cut out of the slab edge. So it's a podium, concrete podium with wood above. So the podium slab edge is cut, and I think it's literally like 6 3/4 inches. So that's the amount of detail, and that's got wood fiber, whatever insulation that we're using in there. So it stops all the thermal bridging.
Right.
And because it's DC and the climate, we do have sun shading in DC where we don't ever have to use that in Boston or the Northeast. But the we don't have to, the added insulation is not, it did not end up being necessary, which will be funny because now there are building codes, right, that require continuous insulation
Right.
prescriptively. Like they don't know that it, you know, unless it's continuous or installed correctly, that it makes a difference. But
for the 4 floors above, you've got continuous wood fiber insulation, and that's coming from Blueprint Robotics.
No, we don't have continuous on the outside. It's
so that's got it.
So we have a 2x6, and then we have a little service cavity on the inside. But it's not continuous on the outside, and
that's a combination of climate, size of the building.
The density, maybe.
The density of units, and triple pane windows.
Yep.
Okay.
Alpine windows. Yep.
But only a 2x6 stud wall with what kind of insulation in it?
Well, we try to not do any foam, but I would have to look.
Okay.
Too many of these to sort of keep up with. It
Sure,
may be
sure.
a 2x8 for structural reasons, but anyways, it's just that cavity full of insulation.
Yeah. God, I can't wait to see those drawings. Okay. Oh, Daniel Clark. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so Bryn, the making was it making home 2 that Kennedy Stewart put forward, 6 dwelling units on a single family lot. It's all about, okay, how is that going to be implemented? Have you heard anything, maybe some inside knowledge on how the planning department and maybe VBBL would be responding to that in terms of what specifically might they allow?
Yeah, I mean, we've been in a number of workshops lately, and as background for everybody else, this was a proposal recently, which was the idea that they'd allow you to go from sort of so-called single family up to, say, a 6-plex, as long as 1 or 2 of those units were either affordable, whatever that is, or paid into like an affordable housing fund or something. So this sort of conditional upzone idea. Now, when we were looking at that, you know, that's where our modeling came in, because we figured you kind of needed to be at about apartment density around 1.4 FSR to sort of maybe make that work. But in talking to the city planners, they seem to think that the limitation for distributed density is around 1 FAR or FSR. And the reason for that is that the sewer department considers, once you get to 1.2, that sort of townhouse density, they're assuming that you're going to have a lot of site coverage and an underground parkade or something else where you're going to get a whole bunch of stormwater runoff and overwhelm the system. Now, I think there's a methodology problem with how they're calculating that, but I also think that it's an opportunity to look at how we could go to a different building type that would, you know, maintain almost the same site permeability as a single family house, but have 2 or 3 times the density. And that's where this kind of point access block becomes quite compelling in comparison to a lot of these other types that have been done previously. So I think, you know, in the near term, I think we're going to see 1 FSR allowed for 4 plexes, you know, probably in the next year or 2. Hopefully then we can go beyond that to sort of, you know, apartment equivalent density, but there's some stuff to get worked out. We also need a decent election in October to make it happen.
Hence the zoning is the future of green building comment. Again, I just love that. You're absolutely right. I mean, it really changes things.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much you can do with the building, but site selection, walkability, those all have to do with planning and what they allow. And it's really over and over again, we keep bumping up against the zoning. And, you know, I've been talking to municipalities all around North America about laneway houses and ADUs. So I was really glad to see when California and Oregon and some of these places started changing the zoning statewide, because that's really the future of what needs to happen, is to do this stuff at scale. Because, you know, banging my head against every municipality, one little city after one little city, is just a way to make yourself crazy. But you know, once we start, you know, New Zealand did it for the whole country. And I think that's really the future of where a lot of our advocacy work around green building needs to be, you know, channeled into, you know, seeing that kind of change.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's first time I've ever thought about it, but because from an advocacy perspective, we tend to focus more on green building, you know, policies, right? Not zoning policies, which are green building policies if done correctly. So that's a really interesting way to look at it. There are a bunch of questions here that are kind of open to all the presenters, and I think they're good questions around affordability and financing. So I'll just throw out a couple. Jim Kuman asks about, are any panelists using private capital that aren't also, you know, where you're not also a partner in the deal? So who wants to speak to that?
Are you talking about our own money, or are you talking about like acquisition money or construction money? What do you mean by private?
Jim?
Any and all models that you might be looking at, because I know there's lots of hybridized.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we started 20 years ago, we didn't have, you know, a big bank role, but so we just made the most of all the subsidies. And then as we grew, we do make some of our own investments in the property, in our projects, but there's quite a capital stack, and I'm not one of the real estate developers, thank God, because I don't know that much about it, but there are geniuses in it, and it becomes really complicated on where the money's coming from and what it's coming to, and what the structure is. So I can certainly look into that and give you some different model ideas that we do, but that's kind of the basics.
How about you, Bryn? I guess your clients are funding them themselves, right?
Yeah, we're not a developer, we're a designer and builder, so we don't typically deal with that. But we find, you know, with laneway houses, single family owners are often drawing on a home equity line of credit. You know, so many of these owners, they bought, you know, that lot for $150,000 and now it's worth $3 million. So the banks are happy to finance, you know, those kind of projects. But I think this discussion about missing middle and then affordability, I think there's the typology discussion, which is, should we make this type of building for all the reasons in terms of climate and walkability and livability and all these lovely things? And then there's the affordability piece, which is, how do we, you know, actually make this accessible and attainable? Can we separate the land ownership from the housing security of tenure? Like, there's all these pieces that are important, but it's something that's new to me. That's what I'm also interested in picking up from this conversation.
Yeah, and that's what Dylan and Liz seem to be doing really well, right?
Yeah, I'm really interested in this limited equity co-op.
Me too.
I think we have one co-op building in Vancouver, but I think if we could somehow get the security of tenure without the, you know, and separate or decouple. I know that there are some groups that are doing decentralized ownership using blockchain and some of these other things. I think you know, there's as much innovation that has to happen around the financing as there is around the building.
Absolutely.
I would second that. Absolutely. Yeah. As an analogy for the Passivhaus consultants out there, you know, what I've learned in my 4 years becoming a developer is, you know, the pro forma is my PHPP, and the economic, you know, bottom line is 4.75, hitting those numbers. And you know, instead of fighting the building code or the climate or something, I'm fighting the financing instruments that are out there, which at the scale of a single family lot, small, you know, middle housing developments, there's not a lot out there. You can do up to a 4-unit project in a residential conforming loan, but beyond that, it's kind of wide open. To speak that directly to the question, I do think private social capital is going to have a pretty important role to play in this kind of new territory of middle housing, because banks are just inherently conservative. And yeah, if you own a very expensive property and you're developing backyard housing, that's a pretty easy one for the bank to get behind. But if you're a developer that's coming in, you just paid, you know, a very high premium, and now you're going to tear down the house to build more housing potentially, or you're going to keep that house but build some other housing in the back but not put any parking in. You know, those are the things that a bank has never seen before, and they'll just say, "Meh, we'll pass on this one." You know, there's no reason, the project's not a large enough scale for them to bother with, you know, the headache of thinking about something outside the box. So we did, like I said, we went 100% social investors for the construction loan on our project, and I imagine we're going to be doing that pretty as a standard approach. And I do hope the permanent financing we keep through the banks, just because it's a real headache to try and manage long-term capital. But the limited equity co-op piece is really cool. It's been around a long time. There's a very rich history in this country. That's a really cool resource to say, okay, at least this part is nothing novel. We've been doing it for 100 years now, and we've got plenty of examples to point to prove it as a, you know, we're well beyond the proof of concept stage. The trick is getting it financed. That's the hard part, is finding a bank that will, especially in the West Coast. There's a smattering of areas in the country where cooperatives exist at all, and if outside of those clustered areas, you just can't find lenders who even know what a co-op is, much less are interested in writing you a loan for one.
And Liz, do you know what the capital stack was in that project? It may have been before your time, but did it involve similar social investors, or was it a typical, you know, institutional lender that you just developed a pro forma that made sense and they funded it along with the subsidies you discussed?
That's exactly what happened. So there was a bank that was willing to fund the remaining of the budget that wasn't covered by the subsidies that we received from mass housing.
And so it's really just the pro forma has to prove it out, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Leonardi, you had a question. I'm not quite sure I understand it. Do you want to maybe articulate it?
Yes, thanks. And it was more for Dylan, if I understood correctly. He's only using private money for these affordable units. So is there any kind of restriction when you sell the property? When you have subsidies, there are obviously an affordability restriction with the property, but I'm wondering how does that work with only private funds, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, the social investors were primarily for the construction financing, and so for that it was really I had investors that the cool thing about working with social investors is they, especially when it's local private individuals that you know personally, and I didn't know them before the project, so it's not as if there was just like a family member thing. They really care about doing a cool project. Like if I went to them and said, "Hey, I want to borrow $1 million and I'm going to make, you know, some good money, but we're going to call it green. It'll look good." They'd be like, "Nah, no thanks." You know, they really cared about me doing a transformational kind of a housing project as a you know, a proof of concept. And so that was really front and center for this group of folks. And I will say, as I've kind of gotten to know more and more developers doing my line of work in the area, that demographic is very large. There are a lot of, I would say, you know, stereotypically retiring boomers who have a lot of money, and they've got maybe more than they know what to do with, or more than they care to leave for their kids, and they want to see change. And you don't need a ton of it to do a project at the scale of middle housing. So in terms of the restraints, so for that construction loan, it was as simple as promising an IRR to them after we sold the property, after we built and sold the property. So that ranged from a 2% to 6% IRR, depending on which investor you're talking to. And then beyond that, for the subsidy, that was all managed through Square One. So I'm not super familiar with the details, but it came with the typical strings attached that affordable housing has. It had to be limited to 60% AMI maximum income households. There's not a lot of low-income housing subsidy out there that will be that limited equity co-ops are applicable for. Right. So that kind of helped in a way in that we didn't have the strings attached like you have with a LIHTC, like a tax credit funding. So, but yeah, that's the problem with subsidy, and it's why I'm really trying to hone a pathway to not rely on subsidies, so that I can really generate, kind of do the experimental typologies like Bryn is talking about. It's hard to do that when you're dealing with a subsidy that requires, you check these 20-page document of boxes and make sure you comply with all these criteria. It just, all these unforeseen consequences fall out of that process that really limit innovation. So I'm kind of trying to straddle both the unsubsidized and subsidized world, but stick within the workforce affordable ownership spectrum.
Yeah. I had a quick question for Julie. There was this gap between the image that you showed of the existing of the first houses that were built, and then it went to the housing that was built by DC Housing, I think you mentioned. What happened in that period? Did the original owners lose their homes?
Sadly.
And was it
eminent domain?
Eminent domain.
So there was a big highway, I can't remember the name of it, that went through. Renewal. Yeah. And then there was effectively two highways that kind of destroyed the whole place. It split it in half and blocked the remaining residents from the Anacostia River. And then the other one, and they thought rebuilding multifamily would serve the purpose. But I think it's just, that's why that first image is so important, because the residents are, obviously and understandably very cautious about what the redevelopment is going to be. And we're maintaining 6 of those, the current historic buildings, and hopefully that will be remnant enough, as well as trying to do something like the wood frame homes that were built by the individuals that live there. But,
and you have access to some of the families that have been there for like they will move back into these.
Yeah. The goal is, and the housing authorities are all pretty good about that. All the partnerships we do, if there has to be relocation, which we avoid at all costs, but when the buildings are in this kind of condition, the only choice is to redevelop. And we looked at phasing the redevelopment so that people could, one group could move and then they could come back, and but sometimes it's better to just have access to the whole site, redevelop it. But they have there's apps for this. We have consultants that work for us. They have ongoing activities, ongoing conversations, in a way to stay connected to I don't know how many they're connecting with right now, but it's a lot.
That's really wonderful.
Tim, if I could throw a quick comment in here. Something I've learned through this public advocacy work is that the racial wealth gap in America today is worse than it was in 1963. And a big part of that is the inequity in home ownership, right? I can trace the white men of my family that have owned homes for, as far as I can remember, and that wealth is passed on. It wasn't a ton, but it was enough to get me started, right? And that just doesn't exist often outside of for other groups. So that's a big reason I'm so passionate about affordable home ownership, not just affordable housing.
Yeah, yeah, and that's even more difficult than rental. Like you're giving yourself lots of challenges here. It's one thing to do attainable housing or workforce housing that's for rent. That's challenging, but it's a lot less challenging than home ownership.
One of the interesting benefits of it is that, and Bryn mentioned this in relation to another aspect, but it's important. It's politically kind of nonpartisan. There's plenty of our legislators from the red counties in Oregon that are very into a home ownership. They're very into these limited equity co-ops because of that home ownership piece. And so anytime you can find those kind of nuggets that you don't create political division, that's really helpful. So that's a cool thing. You know, home ownership is a pretty deep American value, and I think it's nice that way.
Yeah. I want to jump to something. It's a simple question from John Burrell, but I think it opens up some interesting questions around this particular type of housing, the scale of it, and it's about ventilation. So John, are you still here? John Burrell, Beurle.
It looks like he's left.
Okay. Well, look, he asked the question of ventilation, whether who's doing. It sounds like most people are doing decentralized ventilation strategies, one per unit, or are some people finding, depending on the scale of the project, that centralized ventilation makes sense? There's a bunch of issues that opens up. So that's to anybody.
If we can, we do semi-central. So we're putting 80 gallon in for 3 senior units or 2 family units so that we can get away without a recirc line.
For hot water.
For hot water.
And ventilation?
Ventilation. Sorry, ventilation is similar. We do a per floor ceiling mounted ERV, and it might, depending on the length of the corridor, it might require 3. But that kind of gets rid of the vertical shafts, and then it minimizes the size of the ductwork and then the penetration into the unit.
And that first project you're doing, how many units is that?
The senior project is 100 units.
Yeah.
And the family building, I think, is 200. So it will be interesting to see how the systems, because I also prefer a central heating and cooling, but I know we've talked about that too, because I want to have room on the roof for PV.
Yep.
And in DC, you have to have some amount or green roof because they're pretty strict about stormwater management there. So I don't know how or where you would even put the condensers to do 1-to-1.
Yeah. Or, those packaged units that don't have condensers.
Exactly.
But how about you, Bryn? I'm curious. Obviously, most of the projects that you're doing are single family with a couple of with some laneway housing, but you showed some triplexes. And are you thinking more in a decentralized way with these units?
Yeah, I mean, our stuff is pretty much all decentralized. So if you've got a duplex, each duplex unit, even if it has a secondary suite, it has its own separate mechanicals. Sometimes we might put a separate HRV in the basement, but usually it's sort of centralized within for those. When I was talking to Monty Paulson at RDH Engineering, he seemed to think that there was around 20 units. Like you decentralized made sense up to there, and then beyond that, it made sense to go to centralized systems. Just kind of his rule of thumb from having worked through a lot of these passive house projects. But yeah, what we're doing is all decentralized. We can do it if we need to. We can do a Rheem heat pump hot water tank that has an integrated hot water heat pump with ducts, and we can do a Minotaur air handler that also has ducts, and so you've got heat pumps on both, but no outdoor unit. But there's trade-offs to all of those things. So we could go down a mechanical rabbit hole for hours if we wanted to.
Right. Let's see.
Could I throw a question out there for Bryn?
Oh yeah.
I'm curious, Bryn, with the point access housing where you're concept of looking at that kind of 3 to 4 story height and preserving green space. I really love that concept. It's actually helped me kind of articulate something I've been mulling over with the property right now. But I'm curious in terms of accessibility. Well, my first question would be, are you finding that it's marketable to do no elevator for those 3rd or 4th story units? Is that palatable in your area? And the second part would be, have you found any tricks to help make that accessible in terms of a really affordable elevator system or something like that?
I mean, there definitely are lower cost lift systems that are not like a full elevator. It kind of depends on your local code, but the cost can be cheaper. And I think at 3 or 4 stories, you can kind of get away with that. But you know, in terms of running the numbers, like the stuff we've been doing is all pretty conceptual at this stage, so it hasn't gone through a really rigorous sort of costing. We have put elevators into single family homes, and I always figure if I can do it in a single family house, then I can maybe make it work in something with more units. My hope is that that elevator can somehow pencil out, because I think that the accessibility piece really is an important one that a lot of us kind of gloss over, but I think is incredibly important going forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, there were some questions about the Euro blocks that you mentioned, Bryn. They're typically non-combustible buildings, right? I mean, it's certainly over really any 2-story and above in most European cities are non-combustible.
They are, but I don't think that's the crux of it. I think like in Vancouver, everything is fire sprinklered, and up to 6 stories, you can reach it with a ladder truck. And the evidence, as far as I've seen, doesn't point it to being more dangerous. When I look at the condo building that I live in, it's a big long thing, and it has a stairwell at each end, and that corridor basically just piles 5 times as many people into each stairwells as you would have with one of these point access blocks. Yeah. Like, you lose a little bit of redundancy, but you're just, I really don't think that the trade-off is there in terms of perceived fire safety versus what you lose. And so I'm hoping that we will revisit that, up to about 6 stories.
Right. So look, in the couple of minutes remaining, how about we return to, it's not anything special. It was just the beginning of a definition for the missing middle. How would we change this? How would we add to this? How would we, oh, did I just lose it? Yes. How would we make this more articulate? Missing middle housing describes a range of multifamily or clustered housing typologies that return the diversity, equity, affordability, and climate action currently missing in predominantly single-family zone neighborhoods.
I'll throw out an anecdote from Eugene. We just passed our version of Oregon state law last week, and one of the things the city council threw out was a proposal by the planning commission to allow an off-street parking waiver for small unit housing, anything below 900 square feet. That would have been pretty tremendous for my interest in doing unsubsidized workforce affordable housing. But they tossed it out because of all the public outcry about, we don't want our streets filling up with cars. We want to have off-street parking available. So it quickly becomes a political discussion anytime you touch the zoning code. And I think your definition certainly aligns with my definition and where I want to see middle housing going. But unfortunately, we live as part of a wide community that has a lot of diverse views.
Sure.
And not all of those are aligned. So it really depends on how jurisdiction, and unfortunately it is jurisdiction by jurisdiction, how they decide to implement middle housing. It really is important how the letter of those laws are written.
Yeah, and the parking, you make a really great point. I mean, parking requirements can completely shift the possibility of, as Bryn suggests, like the focus on the single family lot and what can be done within that single family lot rather than aggregating lots together for larger projects, like parking becomes an essential question. And do you introduce the concept of street parking, which has chargers in it, so it's public, but it has the ability to shift the tenant's understanding of transportation from a gas powered vehicle to an electric vehicle, and can that be a public amenity the way a handicap accessible parking space is on a public street? I don't know, but it's that kind of creative ways of thinking about every one of these issues in the zoning code that we have to rethink.
Yeah, I think the concept of the pedestrian pocket, which has been, I think that was published back in the 70s or 80s maybe, but this concept that having these walkable neighborhood cores, I think is a really important concept that is not yet, still decades later after that was written, still not really caught on certainly not in the public conversations of our next step of making the zoning codes more sustainable. And when you do that, you can say, okay, we're going to say this area doesn't need off-street parking because we're going to design this as a walkable neighborhood. For folks in Boston, this is what I'm saying doesn't make sense, but I'm, in Eugene, Oregon, which is, 90% was built after zoning codes were enacted. It's basically a town of suburban sprawl. There's very little city even though we're a city of metro area of 250,000 people, there's very little urban fabric here. And even what was there, we tore down half of it in urban renewal. So there's a lot of work. And I think that's pretty representative of the American situation writ large.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we've come to the end, right, Zach? And I just want to thank Passivhaus Accelerator again for conceptualizing this summit. I think it was a fantastic discussion. I can't imagine any better people than the panelists here. So thank you all for your time.